Okay, what you see here is standard sagittal section through the cortical region. There's midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, as well as the cerebellum back here. That's on the left side, and on the right side you have, this will be an intact, it's going to be a face eventually, and then there's something known as Horner's syndrome. Has anyone ever heard of Horner's before? Something you need to be aware of as far as clinical practice is concerned for differential diagnosis purposes, to know what's in our scope of practice. It's also a standard boards question. Okay, so we're going to learn about, and Horner's syndrome is the result of a sympathetic tract pathway dysfunction. So getting started, before we talked about this structure in here, if I represent it like that, that's going to be your thalamus. Okay. Underneath the thalamus is this little structure. Have you guys talked about the hypothalamus at all in physiology yet? A little bit? Not much?
Endocrine, I think we're starting.
Endocrine, yeah, okay, it's going to be big in endocrine. Okay, so this is going to be, so here you have your thalamus, and just under your thalamus, it's going to be important in the endocrine system. It's a structure known as the hypothalamus. It's H-Y-P-O, thalamus. And the sympathetic tract actually originates in the hypothalamus and goes down to spinal cord levels T1 through T3. You remember when we looked at brainstem cross sections earlier, there's a little speck that usually travels around with the STC, and I said that's the sympathetic tract. We'll talk about it at the end of the semester. Here we are. That's what this is. So with the sympathetic tract, it actually synapses with neuronal cell bodies in the lateral gray horn of T1 through T3. So these represent neuronal cell bodies in the lateral gray horn. Bless you. Okay. So what you have is neuronal cell bodies in the hypothalamus send out axons that come on down in synapse here in the lateral gray horn of T1 through T3. And it's this set of axons, this series of axons traveling down from the hypothalamus. When we looked at cross sections of the midbrain, the pons, and medulla, that's what we saw as the sympathetic tract. So the other important player here is represented outside, but this blue circle is going to represent something known as the superior cervical ganglion. So the neuronal cell bodies in the lateral gray horn of T1 through T3 send out axons that then synapse here with this superior cervical ganglion. Yes?
What is the
The superior
superior cervical ganglion located?
cervical ganglion is in the area of the cervical region, but if you remember the dorsal gray horn, the dorsal root ganglia, this is, and the trigeminal ganglion that we talked about earlier, this this is just a ganglion ganglia means neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So it's just a ganglia, just a concentration of neuronal cell bodies that contain neuromotor neurons, okay, outside the central nervous system. Okay. So the cervical ganglion then sends out axons that go to 3 different things. We look at the intact. I had to draw a normal looking face. I'm going to give this person normal eyes here, and it's not necessarily important for this pathway, but give him a smile. He's happy. The eyes aren't constricted, they're not super dilated, they're just normal in size. Okay, so this is a person with an intact sympathetic tract pathway. Superior cervical ganglion sends out axons that go to 3 different places. The first place is up here, going to synapse with something known as the superior tarsal muscle. Does anybody remember the name of the muscle that's innervated by ocular motor, cranial nerve 3, that's responsible for eyelid opening? Palpebrae. Good. Levator palpebrae does its action. It initiates eyelid opening. It's the job of the superior tarsal muscle to maintain that eyelid opening. So levator palpebrae works, superior tarsal keeps it open. Okay, and that's through the action of the sympathetic tract pathway. Another place that superior cervical ganglion is going to innervate is going to be the muscle that's responsible for pupillary dilation. If you remember way back when I talked about this muscle, the sphincter pupillae was the one that's associated with the parasympathetic pathway. Does anybody remember the name of the muscle that's responsible for pupillary dilation? That would be your dilator pupillae. Okay. So sphincter pupillae causes pupillary constriction. That's a parasympathetic action. But pupillary dilation due to sympathetic activation is going to dilate your pupil. And the third thing that superior cervical ganglion connects to, that's part of the sympathetic tract pathway, is facial sweat glands. So, facial sweat glands. Okay. If I had to label sides of the body here, and if you're looking at the intact, this is going to be the left side, this is going to be the right side. Now, I'd like to draw Horner syndrome, a representation of Horner syndrome over here, and this is going to be the left side, and this is going to be the right side. Okay, and let's say that this is, so this sympathetic tract exists, and it's going to be, let's say this is the sympathetic tract disruption. Okay, and let's say that it's the left sympathetic tract that was disrupted. If you remember, there's a sympathetic tract on the right side, sympathetic tract on the left side. When you look through cross-section of the brainstem, and the sympathetic tract is just that little dot. It was represented as a little dot that travels around with the STT. We can go back and look at that again today. So what happens if there's a sympathetic tract disruption? That any time there's an injury to the sympathetic tract proper or anything in here out of these neuronal cell bodies, you're going to get a presentation that's known as Horner syndrome. And Horner syndrome has 3 main parts to it. first part is you're going to get a disruption of the superior tarsal muscle. So instead of having a wide open eye, you're going to have a drooping eyelid. Okay, I'll write that down here. This is going to be disruption of superior tarsal, and that's a drooping eyelid. And that makes sense because it's the job of the superior tarsal muscle to keep that eyelid fully open once the levator palpebrae has initiated eyelid opening. Does anyone know what the medical term is for a drooping eyelid? That would be called ptosis. P-T-O-S-I-S. Ptosis. So the first part of Horner syndrome is patient's going to present with ptosis, ipsilateral ptosis. And ptosis means nothing more than a drooping eyelid. Okay, second part of Horner syndrome is on the right side, it's going to look like normal. You're going to have a normally dilated pupil, but in the absence of the dilator pupillae working, you're going to have a constricted pupil on the ipsilateral side. Okay, so this is pupillary constriction. Okay, this pupillary constriction has a medical name, medical terminology name, and it's called meiosis. M-I-O-S-I-S. So you have ptosis and meiosis. And there's one more part that's going to be affected. You're going to have on the person's still happy. But on the ipsilateral side, you're going to have lack of sweat glands, so the person's going to get hot due to lack of sweating. So they're a hot, dry, red face. And this is known as anhidrosis. A-N-H-I-D-R-O-S-I-S. Lack of facial sweat. Okay, so patient with a disruption of the sympathetic tract pathway presents with something called Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome has three basic parts: ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis. Okay, Dr. Friend has made that into a cheer. Yes?
And so that disruption can happen anywhere along that track right there?
Anywhere along the track. So something to the superior cervical ganglion, or something coming out of the lateral gray horn, T1, 2, 3, 3, or the sympathetic tract itself. Okay? Yep. Gio?
That anhidrosis would only be on that one side of the face.
It's only ipsilateral. The ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis are only on one side of the face. Yes, it's ipsilateral. Do you have another question?
So if if there was a lesion of just T1, would you get all of those symptoms, or is they correspond with?
It's a lesion to the it's the T1 lateral gray horn. So those are neuronal cell bodies in the lateral gray horn of T1 through T3.
Okay.
Okay. You can get sympathetic tract dysfunction in patients that have spinal cord lesions above the level of T6. That's something you'll learn about next year, okay? But in general, if there's and we're going to see it today when we do the brainstem vascular syndromes, whenever you lose that sympathetic tract, you're going to have a presentation of Horner syndrome. Okay? Important to know, sometimes patients that get whiplash injuries after a car crash can present with Horner syndrome. It's just something I think you should be aware of, because that's definitely outside of our scope of practice. So if you have a patient that comes in after a car crash and one pupil's teeny tiny and their eyelids drooping and they start going on the bike and one half of their face gets red and isn't sweating, Horner's refer. Okay? That's why that's important. Other questions about Horner syndrome? Okay, so when I talk about sympathetic tract pathway disruption, and later slides with PowerPoint today, that's what I'm talking about. Now we're going to move on to cranial nerves and blood supply. Okay, so this is where we put together the first half of the class, first half of the semester, as well with the second half of the semester. And here you have this, my standard, here's your midbrain with your cerebral aqueduct, which is a nice landmark. Here's your pons, here's your medulla, spinal cord, and back here the cerebellum. What I'm going to do with this drawing is to list the cranial nerves. Okay, put those in place where they belong. We talked about this previously. Then over top of that, I'm going to overlay blood supply. And we're going to talk about blood supply to each of the specific cranial nerves. Let's start with, I'm going to start with cranial nerve 3 up here. It's going to be your oculomotor. I'm only going to put them ipsilaterally. I'm just going to put them on one side. Okay, this is cranial nerve 3, ocular motor. Okay, cranial nerve number 4. Talked about this before. It's the only cranial nerve that exits dorsally and then comes around and decussates and then comes around the front. There's cranial nerve number 4. Okay, so cranial nerve number 1 and 2 aren't in the brainstem proper, so they're not going to apply here. Cranial nerve number 4 is trochlear. Okay, then there's cranial nerve number 5 going on down. So 3, 4. Next one in order is going to be cranial nerve number 5. Coming here, lateral pons. That's your trigeminal. Remember way back when, cranial nerve number 6, after 5's lateral pons, cranial nerve number 6 comes in and is very medial, still in the pons. So 5, 6, and then right next to 6 is cranial nerve number 7 and cranial nerve number 8, all exiting the pons. So 5, 6, 7, and 8. This is abducens, and then this is cranial nerve 7 is facial, and then cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear. Okay, so just a little bit of review. 3, 4 above the pons, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the pons proper. Coming on down, we have cranial nerve number 9, the next in the sequence, and cranial nerve number 9 is going to be right here. And then just below that is cranial nerve number 10. Glossopharyngeal. And cranial nerve number 10 is vagus. Okay, cranial nerve number 11 doesn't come out of the brainstem proper. It comes out of the alpha motor neurons located in the ventral gray horn, and that's at C1 through C5, so that's not going to be part of the picture. The last cranial nerve that we talked about previously that comes out of the pre-olivary sulcus that I'll put here is cranial nerve number 12. Okay, that's a big one. Your hypoglossal. Okay. So, quick review. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 above the pons. 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the pons. 9, 10, 11 coming out of the cervical vertebra. And 12 preolivary sulcus. Okay. Hopefully that looks familiar. Now all we're going to do is we're going to draw in the blood supply. And going way back to the beginning of the semester, we had these two arteries coming up on the right and left halves, going toward midline and fusing together at about the level of the pontomedullary junction. Okay, does anybody remember what those arteries are? Vertebral, right, left and right vertebral. See, twisting it. If you had to guess, which artery do you think is responsible for supplying blood to cranial nerve number 12? Vertebral artery, right, that's it, vertebral artery. So I'm just going to circle the territory for the vertebral artery, and you can see that here it's going to be medial pons. Medial medulla, right? Vertebral artery is more in the middle. Okay, so if you have a lesion that has affected the hypoglossal nerve function, you're going to suspect there's a vertebral artery problem. That's where this is going. Now, coming on up, we had the vertebral arteries left and right coming up at about the level of the pontomedullary junction. They fuse to form one main artery, and that artery goes all the way up to just above the level of the third cranial nerve. What's the name of that artery? Yeah, that's your basilar artery. Good. Okay, and there are small shoots off the basilar artery that we talked about before. Does anybody remember the name of those? Yeah, those are your pontine arteries. Good. So I'm looking at the picture. Any guesses as to which artery supplies cranial nerve number 6? Yeah, pontine basilar. There you go. So there's going to be the territory. So it's more like the little pontine projections. If you have a basilar artery disruption, that's going to be something a little bit different called locked-in syndrome. Has anyone ever heard of locked-in syndrome before? Maybe, sort of. See a couple people nodding their heads. A person with locked-in syndrome, and that's going to be a disruption of the basilar artery in the pons. They lose all movement. They have complete quadriplegia. It's a really terrible situation. The only thing they can move is their eyes. They can look up and look down, and that's it. Everything else is affected. They lose all speech. They lose all swallowing. That's called locked-in syndrome. And we'll talk more about that in neuro rehab next year. Okay, coming off the vertebral artery, we have this nice artery that supplies the posterior inferior surface of the cerebellum. That's pica, right. The left and right pica. Okay, Okay, and when you look at the picture, hopefully you can see that if cranial nerves number 9 and 10 have been affected, you're going to suspect a disruption of pica. Pica is going to be responsible for what's known as lateral medullary syndrome. We'll get to more detail about this, but I'm just trying to get you to see the big picture, you know, how all this comes together. And then moving on to the next one, if you have, there's an artery that comes off of the basilar artery and supplies the anterior inferior surface of the cerebellum with blood, and that's going to be pica sister ica. And ica supplies blood to cranial nerves number 7 and 8. The very last one that we're going to talk about, there is the superior cerebellar artery that comes off up here, but that's not involved in any cranial nerve function. So the last one that we're going to talk about is at the very top of the basilar. The basilar forms 2 shoots just above the level of the 3rd cranial nerve, comes right and left and goes back. Does anybody remember that one? That's your PCA. Awesome. And it's going to be, if the person has dysfunction of the 3rd cranial nerve, then you're going to suspect PCA and basilar. It's going to be a medial midbrain syndrome we're going to talk about. So if you can draw the cranial nerves in their correct position and just superimpose the blood supply that you learned last semester over top of it, you should have a pretty good handle on your brainstem vascular syndromes and what kinds of things they're going to do. Yeah?
For 6, 7, and 8, is that the basilar, the pontine, and the, or which ones is that?
Yeah, I did it. It was not as sharp as it could be. I used the fine tip purple. So cranial nerve number 6 is going to be basilar. It's going to be medial. Cranial nerve number 6 is most medial, what's closest to the basilar. Cranial nerve number 7 and number 8 are going to be pica. And we're going to look at that in more detail here in a minute, so I think you'll see it better in a minute. Yes?
What would supply the 4 and 5 then? Which are general?
So 5, remember, this is where the cranial nerve exits, but if you remember, 5 is that great big thing, the spinal nucleus, the trigeminal, and the main sensory nucleus, so it's going to be all along. When we look at the brainstem syndromes, you'll see, because it's not just this cranial nerve appearance, it's the nucleus. I just think it's kind of cool that I can put the position of the cranial nerves with the arteries, and I know them both, so I put them together, and now I have a pretty good feel for what's happening. But to see what's inside, all those nuclei, we'll have to do some cross sections. We're going to do that in a minute. Other questions? Does everybody see where this is going? So if you learn each of them individually, you can put them together. Yes?
Are pontine arteries, I just had it in my brain that they were always superficial on the pons. Are they like going into the brainstem also?
No, they're just supplying the middle portion of left and right of the basilar. Yeah, left and right of the basilar. Because the blood supply is, look, this is outside of the brainstem. You can pull out, well, we'll get there in a couple weeks, right? We're going to pull out the brains again, and you'll see that blood supply coming up. So, yes, Sarah?
So, you said for the 3rd cranial nerve, is that going to be
PCA and basilar.
And then for 6, you said it's
Just the basilar.
not the pontine, it's
Just the basilar. Yeah, basilar pontine, yeah, it's the pontine on that side. Because if you have a disruption of the basilar, you get both sides, and that's locked-in syndrome. You'll see it more clearly when I go into more detail. This is like the great big overview, so that you can see where everything's coming from. Any other questions? Does everybody see where I am, or where this is coming from? Does it make sense? What we did the blood supply first, and then we did the cranial nerves. Now all I'm doing is putting them together, so that we talk about the brainstem vascular syndromes that are going to be specific. We're going to look at 3 different sections. We're going to look at the medulla. We're going to look medial and lateral medulla. Then we're going to look medial and lateral pons. And then we're going to look up here at medial midbrain. Okay, those are the most common brainstem vascular syndromes that you're going to see. Okay, let's move on then. Let's look at those. We'll start here with left medial medullary. And again, this is just a review because we've already talked about the cross sections through the medulla. But specifically here, we're going to be looking at something known as left medial medullary syndrome. Okay. And like I did before, this is going to be, so this is the medulla. This is just a transverse section through the medulla. And that means that this is going to be dorsal in the back, as usual, and then this is going to be ventral. Okay. Before we talk about the medial medullary syndrome, I just want to go through and label all the players. Does anybody remember this big old pair of tracts here that's going to be most ventral in the medulla? It's corticospinal tract, just the corticospinal tract. Yep, this is going to be your CST. Okay. Okay, if you have a big old prominent cranial nerve, you can see here's the pre-olivary sulcus, that nerve. Here's the neuronal cell body, and then that nerve, cranial nerve, is coming out of that neuronal cell body. Which cranial nerve would that be? Yeah, 12. This is going to be hypoglossal. So here's the hypoglossal nucleus. And then here's the hypoglossal nerve. Or I'll just put cranial nerve number 12. And then here, this is the hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, so just a review. We've already labeled this guy a while ago. Now, here we're looking at medial. I talked before about this being named mostly for a shape, and it carries information from about fine touch perforation and vibration from the extremities and trunk. Does anybody remember what that one is? No, not DCML at that point. Medial lemniscus, awesome. Yeah, this is my medial lemniscus. Remember that, medial lemniscus. So the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus have decussated in those internal arcuate fibers, and then they travel up to the level of the thalamus using the medial lemniscus. Here's one. We talked about this one last class, or last when we talked about the vestibular stuff. This is that tract that's responsible for conjugate eye movement. So it links, it's the one coming from the vestibular nucleus bilaterally that coordinates cranial nerves responsible for eye movements, which would be 3, 4, and 6. Does anybody remember what that's called? It's going to be your medial longitudinal fasciculus, or MLF. Okay, thinking about this little tract right here, carries information about crude touch, pain, and temperature from extremities. This is going to be your STT, yeah. And as I said earlier, this little tract that kind of travels around in all the sections we're going to look at with the STT is going to be the one responsible for Horner syndrome when it's disrupted. That's going to be your sympathetic tract. And we have, let's make them purple. This guy is responsible for just general sensory information coming from the area of the face or anything above the neck. That's going to be, what's that one? anybody remember? Spinal nucleus of trigeminal, or main sensory or spinal nucleus of trigeminal. And then back here we have a nucleus that doesn't know who he belongs to. He's responsible for motor for both cranial nerve number 9 and cranial nerve number 10. This is going to be your nucleus ambiguous. Before labeled the medulla. This is going to be that conduit that connects mostly the pons, a little bit of the rostral medulla with cerebellum. This is going to be your inferior cerebellar peduncle. The last one, not really important for patient presentation, but I like to put it in there anyway because it's a nice landmark. This is going to be your inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, any questions about that labeling? You guys remember going through this when we did the brainstem cross sections, as far as what was what, and like where things reside is going to be important for the purpose of understanding this. Josh?
What's that green dot labeled?
This one is nucleus ambiguous. Is that the green dot here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Nucleus ambiguous. Any other questions? Again, just a little bit of a review, and what I'd like to look at here is going to be left medial medullary syndrome. And I'll put my midline in so it's easy to see where the territory is. And I talked previously about the vertebral artery being responsible. So if I have, I'm going to put my vertebral arteries here, right and left, okay? And this is going to be the left side, this is going to be the right side because this is most ventral. Okay, I'll label that one too. So this is going to be a problem with the vertebral artery. And let's say the left vertebral artery. That's the left side. Okay. I can tell you that the territory for the vertebral artery is going to be very specific. It's going to supply the medial medulla with blood. So if there's a problem with the left vertebral artery, all the structures inside this area are going to be affected. Tell me, if this structure right here is gone, how is the patient going to present? This thing right here, if this is gone, it's not working. Yeah, the tongue's going to deviate to the side of the lesion, right? So tongue deviation to the left. Okay, now the medial longitudinal fasciculus is gone. How's the patient going to present? Yeah, it's something called a dysconjugate gaze. So this produces a G-A-T-E, gaze. Okay, disruption of the medial longitudinal fasciculus is going to produce a disconjugate gaze. The disconjugate gaze, one eye is going in one direction and the other eye is going in the other direction. Okay, they're not smoothly tracking. So if you do something to check their ocular motor function, eyes are going to be going in different directions. So everybody got that? Okay, that's disruption of MLF. Now, if this structure is gone, what's going to happen? Fine touch, vibration, proprioception. Right. And then, if this structure is gone, how's the patient going to present? Lack of strength. Not motor control, strength, right? They're going to have weakness. They're going to present with weakness because this is the corticospinal tract coming down from the primary motor cortex. And it's just that simple. So if you can identify where the lesion is and you understand what's being affected, you can predict left medial medullary symptom patient presentation. And then this is a, let's go ahead and say, a disruption of the vertebral artery. Okay, on the left. Questions about that? Yeah.
Is it so if the lesion's on the left side, all of those symptoms will present on the left side?
Oh, good question. No, that's not true. Isn't that horrible? But what I'd like you guys to do, after I go through all these different brainstem vascular syndromes, there's slides, and there's some blanks left, and your job is to fill in ipsilateral or contralateral, depending on which side you think is going to be affected. Okay? Any other questions? We'll get there. Okay. And that's where the first half comes in to the second half. All right, moving on. This one's left medial medullary syndrome. Let's look at, we can at least label it before we take a break, but let's look at the lateral medullary syndrome. And lateral medullary syndrome is probably going to be your most common that you'll see clinically. It's so common it has its own name. It's called Wallenberg's. Written up there, W-A-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G. So if you hear Wallenberg syndrome, most people will probably say lateral medullary syndrome. Those are the same words. Okay, so going through and doing this again, just a quick labeling. I'm going to try and keep my colors the same. Here's my corticospinal tract here that's going to be most ventral. This is cranial nerve 12 coming out. It's coming out of this nuclear structure up here. This is going to be your hypoglossal nucleus. Okay. In the middle, most medial, this is longitudinal structure. This is going to be your medial lemniscus. Okay. On the outside here, and labeled the inferior olivary nucleus. Colors the same. Yeah, here I used good dark green as here's the STT. And then just usually hanging around with the STT is going to be your sympathetic tract. Okay, just above that, it's going to be your spinal nucleus of trigeminal. Okay, and here is your nucleus ambiguous. And then the last one to label is going to be here. This is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, same labeling we just did, kind of a review from previous class. So, Gio?
Medial longitudinal cruciculus too.
Oh, right there, thank you. Yep. Here's your MLF. Yep, here's your MLF. Everything good? Yes? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break.